In the desert east of the Nile, about 120 miles northeast of Khartoum, there's a complex of ruins that most people have never heard of. It's called Musawwarat es-Sufra. The name loosely translates to yellow pictures, referring to the faded images still visible on some of the walls. What stands there now is a massive stone complex covering more than a square mile. Walls, courtyards, ramps, columns, all built from sandstone blocks that were quarried, shaped, and fitted together with a precision that seems out of place for its location. And here's the thing that bothers archaeologists. Nobody knows what it was for. The site dates to around 300 BC, during the Kingdom of Kush. That's the civilization that rose south of Egypt after the pharaohs declined. The Kushites were accomplished builders. That's not in question. They left behind pyramids, temples, entire cities. But Musawwarat is different. It doesn't fit the pattern of anything else they built. The centerpiece is something called the Great Enclosure. It's a series of connected courtyards and passageways covering roughly 250,000 square feet. The walls are still standing in places, some reaching 20 feet high. They're made of carefully cut sandstone blocks, laid without mortar, fitted so tightly that you can barely slide a piece of paper between them. When you walk through the ruins, and yes, you can visit, though few tourists make the journey, you notice the ramps, wide stone ramps connecting different levels. Not stairs, ramps. That's unusual for a culture that routinely built staircases in their other structures. It suggests whatever moved through here needed gradual inclines. Animals, perhaps, or wheeled carts, though we have limited evidence of wheeled vehicles in Kush. The walls are covered with carvings. Elephants, mostly. Dozens of elephant images in various poses. Some processional, walking in lines, others being led by human handlers. A few appear to be carrying riders or cargo. In ancient Kush, elephants were symbols of royal power. They were used in warfare, in ceremonies, possibly in construction. But the sheer number of elephant depictions at Musawwarat is unprecedented. One theory holds that this was a training facility for elephants, a sort of ancient elephant school, where the Kushites prepared these animals for military service. The ramps would make sense for that. Easier for elephants to navigate than stairs. The enclosed courtyards could have been pens or training rings. There's even evidence of a sophisticated water system that would have been necessary to support large animals in the desert. But other archaeologists aren't convinced. The complex is too elaborate for a training facility, too much decorative stonework, too much religious symbolism. Some sections contain what appear to be chapels with altars and offering tables. You don't typically find shrines in a place meant for breaking in war elephants. The alternative theory suggests Musawwarat was a pilgrimage center, a remote temple complex where people came to worship, perhaps during specific seasons when rain made the journey possible. The water system supports this too. Channels and reservoirs designed to collect seasonal rainfall and store it in underground chambers. Some of these reservoirs still work today, holding water months after the rains end. But if it was a temple, who were they worshipping? The carvings don't show the typical Kushite gods. There's no Amun, no Isis, none of the Egyptian deities the Kushites adopted. Just elephants, animals, natural forms. That's led a handful of researchers to propose it might have been dedicated to an older, pre-Egyptian belief system we don't fully understand. Then there's the mystery of construction. The nearest quarry is 3 miles away. These sandstone blocks weigh several tons each. Moving them across desert terrain without wheels, without draft animals, or at least without clear evidence of how they managed the logistics, that's a significant engineering challenge. The blocks show signs of sophisticated cutting: straight edges, right angles, smooth surfaces. The tools required for that level of stone working would have been substantial. German archaeologists have been studying the site since the 1960s. They've mapped the complex, documented the carvings, analyzed the construction techniques. What they haven't found is a clear answer to the fundamental question: what was this place? There are no ancient texts describing it, no inscriptions explaining its purpose. The Kingdom of Kush left some written records, but Musawwarat isn't mentioned in any that survived. It's as if the people who built it assumed everyone would always know what it was for, so they never bothered to write it down. What we're left with is a massive stone complex in the middle of nowhere, used for some purpose important enough to justify enormous effort, then abandoned sometime around 350 AD when the Kingdom of Kush collapsed. The Danube River cuts through the Iron Gates Gorge on the border between Serbia and Romania. It's a landscape most Americans have never heard of, but in 1965, archaeologists working ahead of a dam construction made a discovery that would rewrite what we thought we knew about early European civilization. They found Lepenski Vir, a settlement of stone structures arranged with mathematical precision. And here's what makes it strange. These weren't crude shelters thrown together by primitive hunter-gatherers. They were sophisticated buildings laid out according to principles that shouldn't have existed for another 3,000 years. The site dates back to roughly 6,500 BC. That's 8,500 years ago. For context, the pyramids of Egypt wouldn't appear for another 4,000 years. Stonehenge was still 5 millennia away. The people who built Lepenski Vir were supposed to be nomadic hunters, following game through the forests, living hand to mouth. But that's not what the evidence shows. When excavators cleared away the sediment, they uncovered more than 50 buildings arranged in a precise pattern. Each structure was trapezoidal, wider at the front, narrowing toward the back, and they weren't randomly scattered. They formed a careful arc following the curve of the riverbank, all oriented to face the water at exactly the same angle. Inside these buildings, the layout was identical from one structure to the next. A rectangular hearth in the center, always in the center. Large limestone sculptures positioned at the rear. Floors made of a polished red limestone and sand mixture that looks almost like primitive concrete. The consistency across every building suggests planning, organization, some kind of architectural standard. The sculptures are what really get your attention. They're massive boulder-sized stones, carved with faces that don't quite look human. Wide eyes, thick lips, expressions that seem caught between fish and man. Some archaeologists think they represent river deities. Others believe they're stylized human ancestors. A few have suggested they might depict an entirely different species that lived alongside early humans, though there's no evidence to support that. What we do know is that these people understood geometry. The buildings follow a precise ratio. The width at the front is always 1.5 to 2 times the width at the back. When you map the entire settlement from above, the structures form radial patterns around central points, like spokes on a wheel. This isn't accidental. You don't stumble into that kind of precision. Dr. Dragoslav Srejovic, the Serbian archaeologist who led the excavation, spent years trying to understand the site's purpose. He noted that the settlement's layout aligned with certain astronomical phenomena. The buildings faced the sunrise during the summer solstice. The spacing between structures created sight lines to specific star positions. But here's where things get complicated. Carbon dating places Lepenski in the Mesolithic period, the Middle Stone Age. The people living here should have been using basic stone tools, hunting deer, gathering berries. They weren't supposed to have knowledge of astronomy or geometry. They weren't supposed to build permanent settlements at all, yet they did. The construction techniques show an understanding of weight distribution and foundation work. They chose limestone specifically because it could be worked smooth. They created those polished floors by mixing crushed stone with organic binders in exact proportions. That's not primitive. That's engineering. And then there's the question of manpower. Moving those massive sculptural boulders into position would have required coordinated effort from dozens of people. That means social organization, leadership, some kind of hierarchy, all things that weren't supposed to exist in Mesolithic Europe. Traditional archaeology tells us that settled agricultural communities developed first in the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq and Syria, around 10,000 BC. The knowledge then spread slowly westward over thousands of years. But Lepenski suggests something else might have been happening. Maybe separate groups developed similar capabilities independently, or maybe there was an earlier exchange of knowledge we haven't discovered yet. Some researchers have proposed that Lepenski was a ritual center, a place people traveled to for ceremonies. That would explain the careful construction and the religious sculptures. Others think it was a permanent fishing village that evolved unexpected sophistication because of abundant river resources. What we can't explain is why it ended. Around 5,500 BC, the settlement was deliberately buried under layers of stone and earth. Not destroyed, not abandoned, buried, almost like the inhabitants wanted to preserve it or hide it. Central Turkey gets hot in the summer. Dry heat that shimmers off the Anatolian plateau. The kind that makes you appreciate why ancient cities were built with thick stone walls. About 90 miles east of Ankara, there's a place called Hattusa. It was once the capital of the Hittite Empire, a civilization that rivaled Egypt in power and influence 3,000 years ago. Most Americans know the Hittites from the Bible, where they're mentioned as enemies of the Israelites. What's less known is that they built one of the most advanced empires of the Bronze Age. They had written laws, diplomatic treaties, a sophisticated bureaucracy, and they built cities fortified with walls that still stand today. At one of the main entrances to Hattusa, there's a gate flanked by two massive stone lions. They're still there, carved directly from bedrock, each one roughly 7 feet long. They've been sitting in that exact spot since approximately 1,400 BC. That's 3,400 years of wind, rain, summer heat, and winter freeze. And they're still intact. The lions aren't decorative, they're functional sculptures, carved as part of the gate's structure itself. The Hittites didn't build these separately and then install them. They found two natural rock outcroppings in exactly the right positions, then carved the lions directly from the living stone. Each lion emerges from the rock as if it's stepping through it, guarding the passage. Look closely at the carving technique and something becomes clear. These weren't the work of amateur craftsmen. The musculature is accurate. The proportions are correct. The paws show individual toes with claws. The faces have expressions, a kind of fierce alertness that's difficult to capture in stone. Whoever carved these understood lion anatomy. They'd studied real lions, watched how they moved, how they held their bodies. But here's what makes this interesting. from an engineering standpoint. The gate itself is built using a technique called corbelling. The walls on either side gradually lean inward as they rise, getting closer and closer until they meet at the top, forming a pointed arch. No mortar, no keystones, just massive blocks of limestone cut to precise angles and stacked in a way that makes them self-supporting. This technique distributes weight differently than a traditional arch. Each stone carries the load of the ones above it, transferring the force downward and outward to the walls. Done correctly, it's incredibly stable. Done incorrectly, the whole thing collapses. The Hittites clearly understood the mathematics involved. The gate passage is narrow, about 7 feet wide, just enough for a cart to pass through. The lions are positioned so that anyone entering the city has to walk between them, close enough to touch. That's psychological warfare. It's a statement of power. We can carve living rock. We can make stone animals that look real enough to bite you. What chance do you think you have against us? There are other animal gates at Hattusa, the Sphinx Gate, with creatures that have human heads and lion bodies. The King's Gate, featuring a carved warrior in full battle dress. But the Lion Gate is the one that survived in the best condition, probably because the lions were carved from particularly hard stone. What's puzzling is the tools. Bronze Age metal technology, copper and bronze tools, isn't ideal for carving hard limestone. Bronze is softer than limestone. To shape stone effectively, you need tools harder than the stone itself. That usually means iron. But the Hittites were only beginning to develop iron technology around this time. Their tools were primarily bronze. So how did they achieve this level of detail? Some researchers believe they used bronze tools along with abrasive materials, sand, harder stone powders, to slowly wear away the limestone. It's a time-intensive process. Carving one lion this way could have taken months, maybe years. That represents a massive investment of labor and resources. Others have suggested the Hittites had more advanced iron tools than we've found evidence for. Iron corrodes quickly in most soils, especially over 3,000 years. It's possible they had iron chisels and cutting tools that have since rusted away completely, leaving no trace. There's also the question of why lions specifically. Lions weren't native to central Anatolia in 1400 BC. The Hittites would have encountered them in other regions, Syria, Mesopotamia, during military campaigns or trade missions. Choosing a foreign animal as a guardian symbol suggests they wanted to project cosmopolitan power, to show they controlled territories far beyond their capital. The Hittite Empire collapsed around 1200 BC, victim to the same mysterious Bronze Age catastrophe that brought down civilizations across the Mediterranean. But the lions remained, still guarding a gate that leads to ruins, still watching a road nobody travels anymore. Homestead, Florida, 25 miles southwest of Miami. Hot, humid, mosquito-heavy terrain that most people pass through on their way to the Keys. But in 1923, something strange started happening on a 10-acre lot along South Dixie Highway. A man named Edward Leedskalnin began building a castle, alone, at night, using coral rock blocks that weighed several tons each, and nobody ever saw him do it. Ed Leedskalnin was a Latvian immigrant, barely over 5 feet tall, weighing maybe 100 pounds, soaking wet. He had a 4th-grade education and suffered from tuberculosis. Not exactly the profile of someone you'd expect to single-handedly construct a stone monument. Yet that's precisely what he did. The Coral Castle, he called it Rockgate Park originally, covers about 3 acres. The walls are made of limestone coral blocks, some weighing up to 30 tons. There's a 9-ton gate so perfectly balanced on a metal pivot that a child can push it open with one finger. There are chairs carved from single pieces of stone, each weighing half a ton. A stone telescope aligned to the North Star. Tables, sundials, a 2-story tower, all made from massive blocks of coral rock. Ed worked alone. This isn't speculation. His neighbors confirmed it. He had no employees, no construction crews, no heavy machinery. He worked primarily at night, using lanterns for light. When people asked how he moved the stones, he'd smile and say he understood the secrets of the pyramids. Then he'd change the subject. In 1936, he learned that a new subdivision was planned near his property. Ed didn't like the idea of neighbors, so he decided to move the entire castle. He bought land 10 miles north, disassembled every single stone structure, transported them using a borrowed truck, and rebuilt everything at the new location. The truck driver, who helped with the transportation, said Ed loaded and unloaded the multi-ton blocks himself. The driver would arrive in the morning to find massive stones already positioned on the truck bed. He never saw Ed actually move them. How did he do it? That's where things get interesting. Ed claimed he'd discovered the secrets of anti-gravity. He talked about magnetic forces and energy currents. He read extensively about ancient Egyptian construction techniques and believed the pyramid builders had knowledge that modern engineers had lost. Some people thought he was eccentric. Others thought he might be onto something. The tools found at the site after Ed's death in 1951 were remarkably primitive. Chains, pulleys, a small tripod made from wooden poles, and an old car axle. Nothing that would explain moving 30-ton stones. There was also a series of unusual devices, wheel-like objects made from automotive parts, arranged in ways that didn't correspond to any known mechanical function. Modern engineers have studied the site extensively. The general consensus is that Ed used a combination of leverage, counterweights, and clever understanding of physics. The blocks, while massive, are relatively uniform in size. That suggests he understood load distribution. The 9-ton gate rotates on a metal shaft that's drilled perfectly through the center of the stone's mass. Getting that balance point exact would require mathematical precision. But here's what doesn't add up. To drill a hole through 9 tons of solid rock using hand tools, even with modern drill bits, takes significant time and physical strength. Ed supposedly did it alone, working with equipment he made himself. The hole is perfectly straight, perfectly centered. That's not easy to achieve, even with modern machinery. Some researchers have proposed that Ed used resonance frequencies to reduce the effective weight of the stones. The theory goes that if you vibrate stone at certain frequencies, you can temporarily alter its mass properties. It sounds like science fiction, but there's actual physics research suggesting that acoustic levitation can work on small scales. Whether it could work on multi-ton blocks is another question entirely. Others believe Ed simply worked extremely slowly and carefully over decades, using mechanical advantage and patience to accomplish what seemed impossible. A long enough lever can move almost anything. Given enough time, one determined man could theoretically move very large stones short distances. What bothers skeptics is the lack of ground scarring. When you drag multi-ton blocks across Earth, you leave marks, ruts, compressed soil, disturbed vegetation. The Coral Castle site shows no evidence of this kind of disturbance from the original construction. It's as if the stones were placed rather than dragged. Ed left behind some writings, cryptic pamphlets about magnetic currents and cosmic forces. They read like the work of someone who believed he'd stumbled onto fundamental truths about physics that mainstream science had missed, or like the eccentric musings of a lonely man trying to make sense of his own abilities. Western China, Qinghai Province. About 40 miles southwest of the city of Delinga, there's a saltwater lake called Toson. It's remote, desolate country, high-altitude plateau, where not many people go. The area is known mostly to geologists and the occasional adventure tourist. In 1996, a group of scientists exploring the region for fossils noticed something odd near Mount Baigong, on the southern shore of the lake. There were caves in the rock face, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual were the pipes, metal pipes, hundreds of them. Some embedded in the cave walls, others scattered across the lake bed. A few protruding from the rock face itself, weathered and ancient, but unmistakably manufactured. The largest cave sits about 200 feet up the mountain face. Inside, there are pipes of various sizes running through the rock. Some are tiny, barely an inch in diameter. Others are close to 16 inches across. They're not uniform, different sizes, different configurations, but they all share common characteristics. They're hollow, they're cylindrical, and they appear to have been deliberately placed. Outside the cave, more pipes jut from the rock at odd angles. Some run horizontally into the cliff face, others angle downward toward the lake. On the lake shore and in the shallow water, there are more pipe fragments, rusted and broken, scattered across an area of several hundred yards. Chinese scientists from the Qinghai Institute of Salt Lakes conducted initial studies in 2002. They took samples and ran chemical analyses. The results showed the pipes were composed primarily of iron oxide, with significant percentages of silicon dioxide and calcium oxide. There were also trace amounts of unusual elements in combinations that didn't match any known modern alloy. The age determination was where things got complicated. The surrounding rock, purple sandstone, dated to approximately 150,000 years ago. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the pipes are that old. They could have been inserted into pre-existing rock formations much later. But there's no evidence of drilling or excavation. The pipes appear to be part of the rock itself, as if they were there when the sediment was still forming. That's a problem. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, didn't arrive in that region of China until roughly 30,000 years ago. Even the most generous dating of advanced human civilization only goes back about 10,000 years. So if these pipes are anywhere close to 150,000 years old, they predate human capability by a considerable margin. Skeptics immediately proposed natural explanations. The most popular theory suggests these aren't manufactured pipes at all, but rather fossilized tree roots. There's a geological phenomenon where tree roots can mineralize over time, creating tubular structures that resemble pipes. The iron content could come from groundwater rich in dissolved metals, which would precipitate around the organic material as it decomposed. It's a reasonable explanation. Fossilized root systems have been found elsewhere that look remarkably pipe-like, but there are details that don't quite fit. Tree roots typically taper as they branch. These pipes maintain consistent diameters. Tree roots follow organic patterns, growing around obstacles. Some of these pipes run in remarkably straight lines, and tree roots don't usually contain the specific elemental combinations found in these samples. In 2007, a researcher named Zheng Jiandong published findings suggesting the pipes might be sedimentary structures formed by geological processes during earthquakes. When seismic activity occurs in areas with iron-rich sediment, it can create tubular formations as material liquefies and then rapidly solidifies. It's an interesting hypothesis, though it doesn't explain the uniform cylindrical shapes or the regular spacing observed in some sections. Local legends add another layer to the mystery. People in the area have stories going back generations about a foreign sky people who lived near the mountain long ago. These stories describe beings who came from above and built structures near the salt lake. Folklore, certainly. But it's worth noting that these stories existed before anyone discovered the pipes. The Chinese government allowed international researchers limited access. Some samples have been examined by metallurgists in other countries. The consensus is that these are definitely ferrous structures of some kind, but there's no agreement on whether they're natural or artificial. The Chinese Academy of Sciences classifies Baigong as an unexplained geological phenomenon requiring further study. That's careful language. It doesn't say ancient plumbing system or fossilized roots. It says, we don't know, which, after nearly 30 years of investigation, is remarkably honest. The pipes are still there, still rusting, still raising questions that nobody seems able to answer. The Scottish Highlands, rolling green hills, grey skies, and a persistent dampness that seeps into everything. About 6 miles east of Inverness, there's a cluster of ancient stone monuments that most tourists never hear about. The site is called Balnuaran of Clava, and it's been standing there for roughly 4,000 years. There are 3 main structures. 2 of them are passage cairns, circular stone mounds with narrow corridors leading to central chambers. The third is a ring cairn, which is essentially a stone circle surrounding an open courtyard. All 3 are aligned in a northeast to southwest line, and they're surrounded by standing stones that form outer rings around each monument. The construction is sophisticated. The passage cairns use corbelled roofing, stones carefully layered and angled inward until they meet at the top, creating a beehive-shaped dome. It's the same technique we saw with the Hittite gates, but here it's applied to entire burial chambers. The engineering required to make these structures stable for 4 millennia is considerable. What makes Balnuaran particularly interesting is the alignment. The passages of the 2 cairns are positioned so that on the winter solstice, the setting sun shines directly down the corridors and illuminates the central chambers. That's not an accident. Whoever built these monuments understood solar mechanics well enough to orient stone structures with astronomical precision. The standing stones add another layer of complexity. They're graded by height, starting with the tallest stone, positioned on the southwest side of each monument, and gradually decreasing in height as you move clockwise around the circle. This creates a visual rhythm, a deliberate pattern that's too consistent across all 3 structures to be coincidental. Radiocarbon dating of material found within the cairns places construction around 2000 BC. That's Bronze Age Scotland, a time when the people living in this region were supposed to be relatively primitive farmers. They had basic metal tools, simple agricultural techniques, and no written language that we know of. Yet they built monuments that required knowledge of astronomy, geometry, and advanced stoneworking. The stones themselves are river cobbles, smooth, rounded rocks gathered from nearby waterways. Some weigh several tons. Getting them to the site would have required organized labor. Shaping them into the precise forms needed for corbelled roofing would have taken considerable skill, and aligning everything according to solar positions would have required years of observation and calculation. What's puzzling is that we don't know who's buried there. The cairns were used for cremation burials. That much is clear from the ash and bone fragments found inside. But there are no grave goods, no inscriptions, nothing that tells us who these people were or why they warranted such elaborate monuments. Similar cairn structures exist throughout Scotland and Ireland, part of a broader megalithic tradition that spread across northwestern Europe during the Neolithic and Bronze Ages. But Balnuaran is notable for how well preserved it is and how clearly it demonstrates the astronomical alignment. Most other cairns have collapsed or been damaged over the centuries. These have survived largely intact. In the 1800s, there was a tendency to restore ancient monuments, which often meant rebuilding them according to Victorian ideas of what they should look like. Fortunately, Balnuaran escaped most of that interference. What you see today is very close to the original structure, with only minimal stabilization work done in the 20th century. Archaeologists have studied the site extensively, but significant questions remain. Why three monuments in such close proximity? Were they built simultaneously or in sequence? What determined who got buried in these chambers versus the countless other people who lived and died in the area? There's also the question of the cup and ring marks. These are circular patterns carved into some of the stones, concentric circles with channels radiating outward, like ripples on water. They appear on megalithic sites throughout Britain and Ireland, but nobody knows what they mean. Theories range from territorial markers to astronomical charts to purely decorative art. At Balnuaran, several of the stones have these markings, but they're weathered and difficult to interpret. One theory suggests the site was a ceremonial center, a place where people gathered for important events, funerals, seasonal celebrations, religious rituals. The winter solstice alignment supports this. Many ancient cultures attached great significance to the shortest day of the year, seeing it as a moment when the sun died and was reborn. Illuminating a burial chamber at that exact moment would have been powerful symbolism. Maharashtra, India. About 250 miles east of Mumbai, there's a complex of rock-cut temples carved into volcanic basalt cliffs. The site is called Ellora, and it contains 34 monasteries and temples excavated between the 5th and 10th centuries AD, but one of them stands apart from all the others, temple number 16, the Kailasa Temple, and it wasn't built, it was carved. The entire structure was excavated downward from the top of a single, massive rock face. Imagine taking a mountain and carving away everything that isn't a cathedral. That's essentially what happened here. Workers started at the top of the cliff and cut straight down, removing an estimated 400,000 tons of rock to create a freestanding temple within a courtyard carved from solid stone. The temple is roughly 150 feet long, 100 feet wide, and rises about 100 feet from its base. It has multiple levels, dozens of carved pillars, elaborate staircases, and intricate sculptures covering nearly every surface. There are elephants, lions, gods, dancers, mythological scenes, all carved from the same continuous piece of basalt. Basalt is volcanic rock. It's extremely hard, much harder than limestone or sandstone. Carving it requires substantial effort and tools that can withstand repeated impact against one of the toughest building materials available. The fact that this entire complex was carved rather than constructed makes the engineering even more impressive. Traditional dating places The main construction during the reign of Krishna I of the Rashtrakuta dynasty around 760 AD. That gives us a time frame. What it doesn't give us is an understanding of how long this actually took. Estimates vary wildly. Some scholars suggest 40 years. Others think it might have taken over a century. A stone inscription at the site quotes the architect's wife saying, "O Lord, how did you build this wonder without using any support?" That's a reference to the fact that the temple is entirely freestanding. It doesn't touch the cliff walls. It's surrounded by a U-shaped trench, carved 60 feet deep into the rock. The temple stands in the middle, separated from the cliffs by this carved void. The work had to proceed in a very specific order. You couldn't make mistakes. If you're building a structure with blocks, you can replace a damaged stone. If you're carving downward from solid rock, every cut is permanent. Remove too much material in the wrong place, and the entire structure becomes unstable. There's no going back. The precision is remarkable. The main shrine features a pyramidal tower with detailed geometric patterns. The pillars are symmetrical, evenly spaced, and consistent in their dimensions. The staircases align properly. The drainage system, and yes, there's a drainage system carved into the rock to handle monsoon rains, actually functions correctly. British archaeologist James Ferguson, who documented the site in the 1800s, wrote that the Kailasa Temple represented the most stupendous single work of art executed in India. He spent considerable time trying to calculate how many workers would have been needed and how long the project would have taken. His conclusion was that it seemed nearly impossible, yet there it was. Some of the carvings depict scenes from Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. There are panels showing multi-armed deities, cosmic battles, and complex narrative sequences. The level of detail suggests that the sculptors weren't just laborers following instructions. They were skilled artisans who understood composition, proportion, and storytelling. What bothers engineers is the structural integrity. Carving a temple from the top down means you're constantly reducing the material supporting the weight above. One miscalculation, one section removed too aggressively, and portions of the temple could have collapsed. Yet it's still standing 1,300 years later, surviving monsoons, earthquakes, and the general wear of time. There have been attempts to replicate the techniques using modern tools. In 2007, a team of researchers tried carving a small portion of basalt using period-appropriate tools, iron chisels, and hammers. They managed to remove a few cubic feet of rock in several days of intensive labor. Scaling that up to 400,000 tons becomes almost incomprehensible. Some fringe theories propose that the temple was carved using advanced technology lost to history, sound waves, laser cutting, things that sound more like science fiction than archaeology. There's no evidence for any of this, of course, but the theories persist because people struggle to accept that 8th century workers could accomplish something that would be challenging even with modern equipment. The Kailasa Temple is still there, still carved from a single piece of rock. UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site, recognizing it as one of the most remarkable architectural achievements in history. Eastern Turkey. The peak of Mount Nemrut rises about 7,000 feet above sea level in the Anti-Taurus mountain range. It's remote, difficult to reach, and bitterly cold most of the year. In 1881, a German engineer named Carl Sester was surveying the area and stumbled onto something that shouldn't have been there. Massive stone heads, giant carved faces scattered across the summit. Some still attached to seated bodies, others toppled and broken, lying in the rubble as if some ancient catastrophe had knocked them from their thrones. The site is a tomb complex built by King Antiochus I of Commagene around 62 BC. Commagene was a small Hellenistic kingdom squeezed between the Roman and Parthian empires, and Antiochus had ambitions that exceeded his kingdom's size. He decided to build a monument that would establish his divine ancestry and ensure his immortality. What he created was extraordinary. On the summit of Mount Nemrut, workers constructed a conical tumulus, an artificial mountain of crushed rock that rises 150 feet high and measures about 500 feet in diameter. That's roughly 5 million cubic feet of stone, all hauled to the top of an already substantial mountain. On the eastern and western terraces flanking this artificial peak, Antiochus erected massive statues. Each statue stands about 30 feet tall when intact. The heads alone are nearly 10 feet high and weigh several tons. They depict Antiochus himself, along with various gods, Greek and Persian deities combined in a syncretistic pantheon that reflected Commagene's position between Eastern and Western cultures. The statues were carved from limestone blocks and assembled on the mountain. Just getting the stone to the site would have been an enormous challenge. There's no quarry at the summit. Everything had to be transported up steep slopes to an elevation where winter temperatures regularly drop below freezing, and snow makes access impossible for months at a time. The construction technique shows remarkable sophistication. Each statue was built in sections, body, head, and various decorative elements, all carved separately and then fitted together. The heads were attached to the bodies with precise joining methods. When intact, these seated figures must have been visible for miles, dominating the landscape. But here's what's strange. The tumulus at the center has never been opened. Antiochus built his tomb somewhere inside that 5 million cubic foot pile of rocks, and after more than 2,000 years, nobody has found the entrance. Archaeological teams have surveyed the site repeatedly, using ground-penetrating radar and other technologies. They've detected what might be chambers inside the mound, but the sheer volume of loose rock makes excavation extremely difficult. Traditional tomb construction in that era usually included a visible entrance sealed after burial. Here, there's nothing. If there's a passage into the tumulus, it's been completely concealed. That level of secrecy suggests either extreme wealth hidden inside or a deep concern about grave robbers, possibly both. The inscriptions on the site are extensive. Antiochus left detailed texts describing his lineage, his divine connections, and his expectations for how he should be worshipped after death. He established a cult dedicated to himself and decreed specific festivals to be celebrated at the site. The inscriptions are in Greek, which was the administrative language of the Hellenistic kingdoms, and they're remarkably grandiose for a king whose realm was relatively insignificant on the larger stage of Mediterranean politics. What's particularly interesting is that the site appears to have been abandoned shortly after Antiochus died. The cult he established didn't last. Within a generation or two, Mount Nemrut was empty. The statues remained, but nobody was maintaining them. Nobody was performing the rituals. By the time the Roman Empire absorbed the region in 72 AD, Nemrut was already a relic. Earthquakes have taken their toll. Most of the statues have toppled, their heads broken off and scattered. The western terrace shows evidence of significant seismic damage, with fragments of statues lying in jumbled heaps. Yet even broken, they're impressive. The scale, the craftsmanship, the sheer ambition of placing these monuments at such a remote and inhospitable location. Modern visitors reach the site by a winding road built in the 1980s. Before that, getting to Nemrut required hours of hiking up rough mountain trails. Even now, the site is only accessible during summer months. In winter, snow buries the statues and the summit becomes unreachable. Archaeologists continue to study the tumulus, trying to find a safe way to investigate what's inside without destroying the structure. There might be treasure. There might be Antiochus himself, mummified or cremated. Or there might be nothing, an empty chamber built purely for symbolic purposes. Japan, the Osaka Plain near the ancient city of Sakai. If you look at satellite imagery of the area, you'll notice something odd among the modern buildings and streets. There are enormous keyhole-shaped structures, perfectly geometric, covered in trees and surrounded by moats. These are Kofun, burial mounds built between the 3rd and 7th centuries AD. There are thousands of them scattered across Japan, but the largest concentration is here in Osaka Prefecture. And the biggest of them all is the Daisen Kofun, traditionally identified as the tomb of Emperor Nintoku. It's massive. The mound is about 1,600 feet long and rises nearly 100 feet high. It's surrounded by 3 moats, concentric rings of water that separate the burial site from the surrounding land. The total area of the complex, including the moats, covers about 460,000 square meters. That makes it one of the largest tombs on Earth by footprint, comparable to the Great Pyramid of Giza. The shape is distinctive, a keyhole configuration that's unique to Japanese burial architecture. There's a round rear section connected to a trapezoidal front section, all surrounded by precisely engineered embankments. From ground level, you can't really appreciate the shape. You need an aerial view to see the geometric precision. Here's what makes this frustrating for archaeologists. Nobody is allowed to excavate it. The Imperial Household Agency of Japan manages these sites, and they've declared the largest Kofun off-limits to investigation. They're considered sacred burial places of imperial ancestors, and disturbing them would be disrespectful. That means almost everything we know about the Daisen Kofun is based on external observation and historical records that may or may not be accurate. Japanese chronicles, written centuries after the Kofun period, claim that Emperor Nintoku is buried there. But we can't verify that. We can't carbon date anything. We can't examine burial goods or construction techniques. We're left with an enormous monument that we can see but can't study. Smaller Kofun that have been excavated tell us a few things. The burial chambers typically contain elaborate grave goods, weapons, armor, jewelry, bronze mirrors, clay figures called haniwa that were placed around the tomb. The haniwa are particularly interesting. Cylindrical clay sculptures depicting warriors, horses, buildings, and ceremonial objects. They provide snapshots of what 5th century Japanese society looked like. The construction of these mounds required enormous labor. The Daisen Kofun alone is estimated to contain about 1.4 million cubic meters of earth. That's dirt that had to be moved, shaped, and compacted by hand. One estimate suggests it would have taken 2,000 workers about 16 years to build, assuming they worked continuously. That's a significant portion of the region's labor force dedicated to a single construction project. The moats add another dimension of complexity. They're not just decorative. They're engineered water features that have maintained their integrity for 1,500 years. The embankments are graded to prevent erosion. The water levels are carefully managed. This required understanding of hydrology and landscape engineering. What we don't know is who actually built these tombs. The traditional narrative says they're imperial burials, graves of early Japanese emperors. But the historical records from that period are sparse and often contradictory. The Nihon Shoki and Kojiki, Japan's oldest chronicles, were compiled in the 8th century, hundreds of years after the Kofun period. They might be accurate. They might be political propaganda designed to legitimize the ruling dynasty. We can't tell. Some historians have proposed that the Kofun represent powerful regional clans competing for status and control. The larger your tomb, the more impressive your lineage, the stronger your claim to authority. In this view, the keyhole shape might be a status symbol, a design reserved for the most powerful families. There's also a question about foreign influence. The Kofun period coincides with significant cultural exchange between Japan and the Korean peninsula. Some burial practices, some artifacts found in excavated Kofun show Korean characteristics. Did Korean craftsmen help build these monuments? Did Japanese rulers import continental expertise? The evidence is suggestive, but not conclusive. In 2019, the Imperial Household Agency allowed a limited archaeological survey of the surrounding area, not the mound itself, but the immediate vicinity. Researchers found clay haniwa fragments and pottery shards that helped narrow the construction date, but they didn't touch the central burial area. The situation is unique in archaeology. Usually, ancient sites are investigated, documented, and studied intensively. Here, one of the world's largest ancient monuments sits largely unexplored because of religious and cultural considerations. Southern Jordan. About 5 miles north of the famous city of Petra, there's a smaller site that most tourists never visit. It's called Little Petra, or Sik al-Barid, the Cold Canyon. While Petra gets thousands of visitors daily, Little Petra sits relatively empty, its carved facades watching over a quiet gorge. The Nabateans built it. Same people who carved the famous treasury and the monastery at Petra. They were Arab traders who controlled the incense routes between Arabia and the Mediterranean from roughly the 4th century BC to the 1st century AD. They grew wealthy, facilitating trade in frankincense, myrrh, spices, and silk. Little Petra is carved directly into pale sandstone cliffs. There are facades, temples, water channels, and what appear to be dining halls, all excavated from the living rock. But unlike Petra, which was clearly a major city, Little Petra's purpose is less obvious. The traditional interpretation says it was a suburb of Petra, possibly a caravan stop where merchants could rest before entering the main city. That makes sense on the surface. The site has large chambers that could have housed travelers and stored goods. There's evidence of elaborate feasting halls where merchants might have gathered. But there are details that complicate this simple explanation. First, the artwork. One chamber contains ceiling frescoes that are extraordinarily well preserved for being 2,000 years old. They depict grapes, vines, birds, and putti, childlike figures similar to cherubs in later Christian art. The style shows Hellenistic influence, which isn't surprising given that the Nabateans traded extensively with the Greek world. What's surprising is the quality. These aren't crude decorations. They're sophisticated paintings that would have required skilled artists and expensive pigments. Why invest that level of craftsmanship in a roadside rest stop? The frescoes are also unique in Nabatean architecture. Petra has elaborate rock-cut facades, but painted interior decorations like these haven't been found anywhere else in Nabatean sites. That singularity suggests Little Petra might have had a special function, something that warranted exceptional artistic treatment. Then there's the water system. The Nabateans were master hydraulic engineers. That's well documented. They built dams, cisterns, and channels that collected and distributed water in one of the driest environments on Earth. Little Petra has an elaborate water management system carved into the rock, including channels that fed large cisterns capable of storing thousands of gallons. That's more infrastructure than you'd expect for a simple caravan stop. It suggests either a large permanent population or gatherings of significant numbers of people for specific purposes. Some archaeologists have proposed that Little Petra was a religious site, a place where the Nabateans performed rituals associated with trade and prosperity. The dining halls might have been used for ceremonial feasts rather than everyday meals. The frescoes could represent religious symbolism. Grapes and vines associated with Dionysian cults that were popular in the Hellenistic world. Supporting this theory is the layout. The site has a processional quality. You enter through a narrow gorge, a miniature version of the famous Sikh at Petra, and emerge into a courtyard surrounded by carved facades. It feels designed to create a specific experience, to evoke certain emotions as you move through the space. But there's no definitive evidence, no inscriptions explaining the site's purpose, no archaeological finds that clearly identify it as a temple complex or a commercial hub or anything else. What we do know is that Little Petra was abandoned around the same time as Petra itself, roughly the 2nd century AD. The Nabatean kingdom was absorbed into the Roman Empire in 106 AD. Trade routes shifted. The incense trade declined as Christianity spread and reduced demand for temple offerings. The entire economic system that supported Nabatean prosperity collapsed. The site was forgotten for centuries. Bedouin shepherds used the carved chambers for shelter. Western explorers didn't discover it until the early 1800s, and even then, it was overshadowed by Petra's more dramatic monuments. The frescoed chamber, called the Painted House, is particularly vulnerable. Exposure to air, moisture, and the occasional tourist has caused deterioration. Conservators have worked to stabilize the paintings, but they're fighting a losing battle against time and environment. Little Petra is still there, still carved into its canyon, still waiting for someone to definitively explain what it was. You can visit, walk through the gorge, enter the chambers, look up at those ancient frescoes, and wonder why the Nabateans went to such extraordinary effort for a site that history almost forgot. The Nile Delta, northern Egypt. About 80 miles northeast of Cairo, there's an archaeological site that most people know from a movie. Tanis. Indiana Jones searched for the Ark of the Covenant there in Raiders of the Lost Ark. The Hollywood version showed a vast buried city beneath the desert sands. The real Tanis is actually more interesting than the fiction. It was a major city during Egypt's 21st and 22nd dynasties, roughly 1000 to 700 BC. At its peak, Tanis rivaled Thebes in importance. It served as Egypt's capital during periods when the country was divided and struggling. Pharaohs built temples there. They were buried there. And then, sometime around the Roman period, the city was abandoned and gradually swallowed by sediment. French archaeologist Pierre Montet excavated Tanis beginning in 1929. What he found was remarkable: intact royal tombs filled with gold, silver, and precious artifacts. The tomb of Pharaoh Psusenes I contained a solid silver coffin and a gold burial mask. The treasure rivaled Tutankhamun's, but it never received the same attention because Montet's discovery happened in 1940, just as World War II was making headlines. But here's what matters for our purposes. Montet excavated only a fraction of the site. Tanis covers approximately 400 acres. Most of it remains unexcavated beneath meters of dirt and debris. Why haven't archaeologists dug it up? Several reasons. First, the water table. The Nile Delta is essentially a massive river floodplain. Dig down more than a few meters, and you hit groundwater. That makes excavation difficult and expensive. You need pumps running constantly, shoring walls to prevent collapse, and specialized techniques to preserve artifacts that have been waterlogged for millennia. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in recent decades have detected anomalies beneath the surface, voids that might be buildings, density variations that could indicate buried walls or statues. One survey identified what appears to be a large rectangular structure about 20 meters underground. It's the right size and configuration to be a temple or palace, but confirming that would require excavation, and excavation requires resources nobody's allocated yet. What makes this particularly intriguing is Tanis's history. The city was a political center during Egypt's decline, when the unified kingdom of earlier dynasties had fractured into competing factions. This was a period of foreign influence, cultural mixing, and political intrigue. The pharaohs of Tanis maintained power through alliances with Libyan mercenaries and careful diplomacy with Assyrian invaders. That means Tanis likely contains artifacts and records from a poorly understood period of Egyptian history. There might be texts describing political negotiations, trade agreements, or military campaigns. There might be royal tombs of pharaohs we know only from fragmentary king lists. There could be temples dedicated to gods whose worship we don't fully understand. One particular mystery involves the location of Tanis's main temple to Amun. Montet found portions of it, massive granite blocks, column fragments, pieces of colossal statues, but he never found the sanctuary, the inner chamber where the god's statue would have been housed. It's buried somewhere under the unexcavated portions of the site. That temple would have contained ritual objects, priestly archives, possibly treasures dedicated by multiple pharaohs over centuries. Egyptian temples were banks, libraries, and administrative centers in addition to being religious sites. The information contained in a major temple complex is potentially enormous. There's also the question of earlier occupation. Tanis became important relatively late in Egyptian history, but the site might have been inhabited much earlier. Some archaeologists think there could be Middle Kingdom or even Old Kingdom remains beneath the better-known later levels. Finding those would require digging through everything above them, a massive undertaking. Current excavations at Tanis are limited to small-scale projects focusing on specific areas. A French-Egyptian team works there periodically, but they're primarily documenting and preserving what Montet found rather than opening new areas. The unexcavated portions remain off-limits, waiting for a time when technology, funding, and priorities align. Satellite imagery shows the site clearly. You can see the mounds marking ancient structures, the depressions where excavations occurred decades ago, and the vast undisturbed areas surrounding them. Somewhere under those unremarkable-looking fields are temples, tombs, palaces, and artifacts that could reshape our understanding of ancient Egypt. They're still there, still buried, still waiting. Some are celebrated monuments that tourists photograph every day. Others sit in remote locations that most people will never visit. But they all share something fundamental. They challenge our assumptions about what ancient people could accomplish. We've looked at stone structures carved with impossible precision, monuments built by single individuals who shouldn't have had the strength. Underground chambers aligned to celestial events by cultures that supposedly lacked astronomical knowledge. Temples excavated downward from solid mountains. Tombs too sacred to investigate. Cities buried beneath their own histories, waiting for someone to dig deep enough. The pattern that emerges isn't one of ancient aliens or lost super-civilizations. It's something more humbling. Human beings, working with limited tools and abundant determination, accomplish things that still impress us thousands of years later. They understood physics we've had to rediscover. They organized labor on scales we struggle to replicate. They built for eternity in ways our modern structures never will. And in most cases, they didn't bother explaining how they did it, either because the knowledge seemed too obvious to record or because they wanted to keep their methods secret. We're left studying the results, reverse engineering ancient techniques, and occasionally admitting we simply don't know. That's what makes these sites compelling. They're not mysterious because they're impossible. They're mysterious because they reveal how much we've forgotten. How many times has human civilization developed sophisticated knowledge, used it brilliantly, then lost it when empires collapsed or priorities changed? These 11 sites represent a fraction of what's out there. There are hundreds more, structures that don't fit conventional timelines, artifacts that suggest unexpected capabilities, ruins that raise more questions than they answer. Some are being studied, others remain unexplored. A few are actively deteriorating, their secrets eroding away before anyone can document them properly. The story doesn't end here. It can't, because every answer we find seems to generate 3 new questions. Every excavation reveals something we didn't expect. Every scientific analysis uncovers details that complicate the simple narratives we prefer. Maybe that's the real mystery. Not how these structures were built, but why we're so surprised that people who lived millennia ago were capable of remarkable things. They had the same intelligence we do, the same creativity, the same drive to leave something permanent behind. They succeeded. If you found these stories as fascinating as we did researching them, consider subscribing to the channel. There are countless more ancient sites worth exploring, more mysteries worth investigating, more evidence that our ancestors were far more capable than we often give them credit for. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll keep digging into history's unanswered questions together.